Wars have always been devastating events in world history. What made World War I so different from wars that came before it? As you watch the video, try to answer that question. And keep track of other questions you have as you learn about the Great War.
World War I took the lives of over 20 million men, women, and children. 20 million. This war saw the collision of many immovable forces: the idealism and arrogance of 19th century politics and the destructive force of 20th century industrialized weaponry. Here's what to remember. This war represented the worst episode of killing and cruelty the world had ever seen. But the United States tried to remain neutral as long as it could. It had an obvious bias to one side of the conflict. We entered the war in its last 18 months, but we provided the deciding force that brought an end to the war. Let's get some context on what we're talking about. Remember the American Civil War? The fighting and its aftermath cost the lives of approximately 500,000 people. That was in a period of 4 years. A true tragedy. Compare that to the Battle of the Somme during World War I. That took place from July to November of 1916. In 4 months, just 4 months, there were over 1.1 million casualties. You see, in the 1800s, wars and battles were fought over smaller things like chunks of land, royal titles, or for religion. In the 1900s, wars will be fought to slaughter human life and challenge the existence of your culture and the existence of your nation. At the time, people described World War I as the Great War. While it all started in 1914 with unthinkable bloodshed, one thing was clear to people and politicians of the United States: we wanted nothing to do with it. So let's examine how it all began. Coming out of the 1800s, Europe was still dominated politically by dozens of rival royal families. While many of them were related by marriage and blood, there was still fierce competition over pieces of land, trade routes, and colonies all over the world. Then, in 1914, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary was assassinated in Sarajevo. That's a city in southeastern Europe. Murdered by a man from a group who wanted Serbian independence from Austria. Soon after, Austria-Hungary moved for war against Serbia. Russia felt compelled to support Serbia, with which it had historic and cultural ties. But then Germany had an alliance with Austria-Hungary. France and England had an alliance with Russia. You get the idea. One after one, each country declared war on one another. These divisions of countries were based on older treaties that created alliances. They were committed to protect each other if they were threatened by another country. So, by August 1914, Europe was at war. Hostilities in World War I started when German forces moved quickly through Belgium and invaded northern France. French soldiers met them just north of Paris. The destructive force of new weapons, like cannon that could shoot over 70 miles, repeating rifles, airplanes, and high explosives were truly seen for the first time. Within a few months of moving skirmishes, both sides took shelter in trenches. Remember that this is a world war. European countries had colonies all over the place. Fighting occurred in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. The countries of Western Europe believed they had built vast empires, and they sought to grow these land holdings and drain these colonies of their wealth. Each country seemed to believe that their culture, history, and way of life was somehow superior to everybody else's. In fact, this false pride, a fatal flaw the Greeks call hubris, existed on all sides of the conflict. Bill Hayne, a young British soldier, wrote home, "Well, I thought the same thing as everyone else. Everyone said, it'll be over by Christmas, and you've got to get out soon, otherwise you won't see anything. But I don't know if it was my opinion or if everybody was saying it. One's mind certainly changed when we found out how well organized Jerry really was. Needless to say, it was not over by Christmas. Both sides dug in. They fought for 4 gruesome years. Hardly any land ever changed hands. Remember that the Industrial Revolution created the innovation of mass production. This also meant that weapons could be made in staggering numbers, while scientific advance made them more deadly and more destructive. Massive battleships and submarines hunted each other on the seas. Airplanes, an invention from 1903, advanced so quickly, from slow observation and reconnaissance roles to deadly dogfighting and bombing capabilities. Machine guns could kill dozens of men in one sweep of a field. And for the first time, each side invented some forms of chemical warfare, attacks with clouds of poison gas. Most of our images of World War I are of men fighting in trenches. These trenches were amazingly complex. They were networks of tunnels, supply lines, and living quarters. But they also collected rain, human waste, and were crawling with rats and other vermin. Let's take a closer look. Forces gathered on opposite sides and dug in. Between the trenches was an area filled with bomb craters, dead bodies, and barbed wire. This became the area soldiers aptly named No Man's Land. Far behind the lines, artillery would periodically barrage the trenches with explosive shells. The landscape turned into a living nightmare. Splintered trees, mud, corpses, blood, and rats dominated the landscape. In the air, planes could drop bombs and strafe the trenches with machine gun fire. The world had seen nothing like this. The killing and carnage was truly unprecedented. For 3 years, the United States stood by as the killing continued. Americans were happy to be on the sideline and could not comprehend why so much killing was taking place for so little cause. Who people supported often depended upon their ethnic origin. Most Americans hoped the Triple Entente would prevail. But the U.S. also had immigrants from German and Austrian descent. They tended to support the Triple Alliance. One thing was clear. Americans had no stomach for fighting a war on foreign soil. President Woodrow Wilson chose his words carefully in 1914.
States are drawn from many nations, and chiefly from the nations now at war. It is natural and inevitable that there should be the utmost variety of sympathy and desire among them with regard to the issues and circumstances of the conflict.
Wilson argued for a policy of neutrality. He hoped he could keep America out of the war. He advised Americans to have dignity of self-control and the efficiency of dispassionate action. Other events would change all this. First, America's tendency to support the British was bolstered when a German submarine sunk a passenger vessel called the Lusitania in 1915. Americans were also swayed by the reports of German atrocities in Belgium and France. Then, in 1917, the United States learned that Germany was trying to enlist the help of Mexico in their war effort. This telegram from an ambassador named Zimmerman was enough for Americans to consent to a declaration of war. A war that President Wilson said would make the world safe for democracy. The United States joined the war effort in 1917. The process of mobilization proved difficult. The Army and Navy were undermanned and their equipment was out of date. The government had to take some unprecedented controls of the economy to ensure that the armaments would make it to the troops. But within 2 years, over 4 million military personnel would be mobilized. All parts of society were urged to help in the war effort. Citizens were encouraged to grow victory gardens. Consumer businesses converted to war production with government contracts. Citizens were encouraged to save energy, collect scrap metal, and consume more judiciously. To get people to help the war effort, the government started a department to control the flow of information. During a war, it is very common to demonize your enemy. Americans were taught to think of Germans as animals and uncivilized Huns. Deliberate distortion of reality for a political end is called propaganda. In the end, World War I took the lives of over 20 million soldiers and citizens. To make things worse, the trenches gave rise to a worldwide flu pandemic. This took another 50 to 100 million people worldwide. The effects were devastating. President Wilson assured Americans that the Great War was the war to end all wars. He told us afterwards that the world was now safe for democracy. And these were hopeful words, to be sure, but only history could prove how wrong they were. World War I was not the war to end all wars. Wars did not stop in the 20th century. In fact, dozens of conflicts around the world can trace their origins to mistakes made during and after World War I. As history will teach us, the United States will be involved in many of those conflicts.